So one of the talks we had during our State of the Lake was an interesting presentation that we wanted to include, certainly fodder for discussion for us, given by Dr. Michael Hansen. He's prof at University of Wisconsin. He was involved heavily in lake trout restoration efforts on Lake Superior. So largely the lake trout population in Lake Superior is considered rehabilitated. Mike was on scene for a lot of those changes, and he was asked if he could reflect on what happened in Lake Superior versus what we're seeing in Lake Huron currently. So I'm going to zero in on some of the slides that he included. So he kind of focused in on some of the major metrics or impacting factors that influence lake trout recovery, whether it can happen or not. The line here actually shows the mean wounding rate in Lake Huron for sea lamprey. The box is kind of a conceptual presentation of where values were for sea lamprey wounding rates on Lake Superior when they saw recovery occur through the late 80s and into the 1990s. So we're down now in the range of what they were seeing in Lake Superior when recovery occurred. So switching gears a bit, the line is now Lake Superior data, and the box represents Lake Huron. This line represents catch rates for stocked age 7 lake trout. So they saw a decline in survival rates for stocked lake trout as wild lake trout abundance increase in Lake Superior, which you would expect to happen as lake trout numbers come up. They're competing amongst themselves for food. Survival rates for your stocked fish go down. It's generally accepted in the scientific community that wild fish are what you want and probably better adapted to your situation. So not a surprise that survival rates for stocked fish came down. We're in that realm now in Lake Huron for our survival rates for age 7 stocked lake trout. So through their recovery process, survival rates came down. Our survival rates are now comparable to some of the lowest that they saw in Lake Superior as recovery occurred. So this is number per net night. This is a view at abundance. The dashed line is stock, so as your survival rates for lake trout came down, their abundance did again. Those two lines represent Lake Superior. The solid line represents what happened to wild fish abundances on Lake Superior. So they were on the order of 20 to 25 fish per net night when they were doing lake trout assessment on Lake Superior. This is really where our biggest uncertainty lies around lake trout recovery on Lake Huron. We're underneath that line on Lake Huron right now for our catch rates for wild lake trout. So our abundances right now for wild fish are lower than they were on Lake Superior when they saw recovery occur. So that's our biggest uncertainty right now with respect to lake trout. So this is Mike's conclusions and some of his recommendations, to the managers and to the broader community around, what to discuss, what to think about lake trout on Lake Huron. So right now we're seeing survival rates for stockfish come down, and because that's happened, we're likely, at least in parts of the lake, our abundances of stockfish have declined to such a degree that they probably can't support or sustain adult densities, hence restoration. Density of wild lake trout is low. It's certainly lower than on Lake Superior, but it's increasing. And one of the major takeaways that he suggested when he spoke in support of his presentation was that because you're seeing survival rates for stockfish come down, your success of your stocking program is declining as a result. If you're going to make the leap and stop stocking lake trout, you need to provide your wild fish with a fair degree of protection because they're the fish that are going to sustain your lake-wide lake trout population. And his recommendation was actually, even though we don't have abundances like we saw in Superior, that we should definitely be thinking about stopping stocking of lake trout. So that's certainly given us fodder for discussion, and we're not going to talk about it tonight, but we are working on a new lake trout planning document for Ontario waters, and certainly that's going to be one of the things that we're going to be discussing is what's going to happen with lake trout stock. Any questions about those presentations before I move on?
Was there any connection, or when you talked about the lake trout and alewife?
Mm-hmm.
Like you said that they weren't feeding on a lot of alewives since the alewife declined, their numbers increased.
Yeah, the way since alewives declined, that's essentially, you know, it's strong circumstantial evidence that without alewives, that's relaxed pressure on, likely was due consumption of emerging lake trout fry as alewives came on shore to spawn. So it's relaxed some negative pressure on lake trout and allowed them to reproduce at rates much higher than prior to alewife collapse. But the converse of that, in terms of an impact of lake trout, is that we've seen the declines in the prey community, and we don't have the biomass in the prey community that we used to, and that's likely why we've seen lake trout growth rates come down. I will say that lake trout, we didn't see any, no detectable change in condition factor, even though growth rates have come down, and they always did have quite a diverse diet, and they continue to have that. They switched to other organisms in the absence of alewives. So they didn't suffer the nutritional stress that Chinook salmon did. They switched prey, and they just grow slower.
The other thing that they didn't mention either, but some of you may have heard of this thiamine deficiency situation, where alewife are strange in that they have thiaminase, which will break down vitamin B basically. And if some fish species like lake trout eat a lot of these alewife, it could really drain them of their vitamin B. And that's what we were seeing when they were laying their eggs. The eggs were getting fertilized, the fish would grow up to a certain size, and then all of a sudden they'd die. And I think even you guys have seen some of that in your hatcheries where you had to treat some of those fish. So now that alewife are out of the picture, they're eating different species, and they're not having this problem with low thiamine and all those things.
Yeah.
So that's probably creating a higher survival.
Yeah, I didn't include any data from that presentation. We did have a presentation on thiamine, and certainly we've seen a very detectable increase in egg thiamine levels after alewives declines, and that's across a number of different salmons, not just lake trout. So thiamine levels have come up quite dramatically after the alewife collapse.
Do you know what they are eating to have detected that?
We have actually. One of the slides toward the end of the presentation shows some diet data, and lake trout are the benthic species, fish from the bottom of the lake, are a fair chunk of lake trout diet, and largely that's very strong round goby signal in lake trout diet. So they have switched to other prey items in the absence of alewives.
What caused the alewife decline? Was it because of lower feeding, what they were feeding on declined?
It's probably not any one factor. Probably what we kind of coin as biologists like bottom-up effects. You saw those graphs that showed a decline in plankton abundances in Lake Huron. Well, alewives are a plankton feeder. That's what they eat. So they weren't getting as much forage as they used to. There's been a couple papers written about fat content, lipid content in the alewives, and it was gradually on the decline prior to their collapse. So the alewives weren't getting as much to eat. They don't have as much fat content. Fat is what gets a lot of cold-blooded species through the winter. So if you're declining fat resources in your tissues, you're going to find the winter that much harder. Alewives are on the edge of their range in the winter, so that's bottom-up effects to alewives. Top-down, we had ramping up the stocking rates, both for Chinook salmon and lake trout. And I'll show one slide, our natural reproduction study fairly clearly is showing that natural reproduction for Chinooks came up very dramatically for about 10 to 15 years prior to that, or we think over a 10 or 15 year period. Certainly in the early 2000s we showed that the lake-wide Chinook population was wild. So that means there's a lot more Chinooks out there than we expected feeding on alewives. So they're getting kind of crunched from both directions. You pile on top of that, the winter of 02-03 was on average a very harsh winter. We had, if you recall, we had nearly complete ice cover. Alewives are on the edge of their range through the winter. That's kind of a perfect storm for an alewife collapse. A few other factors mixed in there, so it really wasn't any one factor, but kind of all amounted to that collapse that we saw by 2004. Go ahead.
You talked earlier about the importance of phosphorus. I think I know why there isn't as much now, but I'd like you to tell us.
Sure.
And your projection, is that going to change or not? And if it doesn't, how is that going to affect the lower system?
There is quite an interesting story around phosphorus. The Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement that was drafted in the, I think the first draft was in the 70s. It was largely focused on reduction of phosphorus contributions to the Great Lakes. You know, that was this time when phosphorus contributions through sewage treatment plants were off the charts across the Great Lakes. We had, major productivity increases because of that. That's when Lake Erie was pea soup with algae. So that came into effect, and that has been actually very effective at reducing phosphorus contributions. Since then, since we've been ramping phosphorus rates down because of the negative impacts that causes, we've had Dreissenid mussels invade, and they're a very efficient sink for nutrients, phosphorus being the important one. So as their numbers have exploded around the lake, we now see a lot of those nutrients going into mussel production, where it used to circulate in the open water portions of the water column, and and produce all the other organisms that you expect in the community. The other interesting side of phosphorus, and I won't get too far into the weeds, is that there's some interesting sort of sidebar effects from Dreissenid mussels. They actually recycle phosphorus through their fecal production in the nearshore environment. And there's been some work done, and there's more being done over the next couple of years to try and learn more about that. But it's suspected that recycling of phosphorus is what contributes to that Cladophora growths on nearshore hard substrates. You've got increase in water clarity because of their filtering, plus you've got recycling that didn't used to happen historically of phosphorus, so that amounts to those Cladophora growths that foul beaches when they slough off and die and rot on open beaches of the lake.
And the other factor is botulism, which has been prevalent in recent years too, and they think that the zebra mussels are implicated in that as well.
Yeah.